Nowadays, we're no strangers to remakes. Within the last few years, it seemed like we've been getting remake after remake. Remaking a game is always a difficult task, and it can be accomplished in a wide variety of ways. There's several videos discussing this and the various definitions people have come up with, such as remasters, remakes, reboots, and reimaginings. Sword of Mana, a remake of Final Fantasy Adventure, was released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance. And while it was well received by critics and fans of the Mana series, fans of the original game voiced their distaste for this game. It was a game that radically changed the original, going from a Zelda clone to being a linear action RPG with elements of the other Mana games added into it. Now, I touched on this in the first video, of course, but I actually have a little bit of history with this game. When I was a kid, I received a poster for it from a brother-in-law who told me that the game is a lot like Zelda. I also remember having a Nintendo Power with a guide section for the game, and years later when I started Secret of Mana, I remember making the connection that it was the same series. However, as I also explained, I wouldn't play the game until 2017 after playing Adventures in Mana, and I remember being really upset with the game after reading some reviews and projecting most of those criticisms onto the game's design. Now, funny enough, I went into this review expecting to tear this game apart, but after learning the deeper systems and replaying the game, my opinions have actually changed. You all might be pleasantly surprised by what I have to say. While I still have my problems with this game, it might be one of the best games I've had to play in the series so far. So without further ado, let's talk about Sword of Mana for the Game Boy Advance, a remake of Final Fantasy Adventure. Or Mystic Quest if you live in Europe. In the years following Legend of Mana, many things had happened internally at Square. Square had merged with Enix to become the company we know today, and the team who had worked on Legend of Mana had left to become Brownie Brown, who you might know as the developers of the cult hit Mother 3. During this time, it seems Koichi Ishii, the series creator, looked at the original game and realized how distant the series had gone from that title, and decided to give the game a remake. And so Brownie Brown was hired to work on this remake since they were already well familiar with the series. Now, I neglected to mention this guy in the first review, but they also brought back the original composer Kenji Ito to compose for this remake. The main goals for this remake were to take the original game, remove the Final Fantasy elements which were added to the original for marketing purposes, and expand the story while updating the mechanics and visuals to be on par with a modern Mana game. This was a game that was intended to bring the whole series together, right back to where it started. The game's name in Japan was Shinyaku Seiken Densetsu, or New Legend of the Holy Sword, with the Western title being revealed as Sword of Mana. And guys, I love this title. I think it's very fitting since the entire series is named off the Mana sword in Japan, so what better game to give this title than the original game? So before I begin talking about Sword of Mana, I wanted to take a little bit to talk about the original game again. Now, I want to address a mistake I made in the first video as I'm a dirty American, but this game is called Mystic Quest in Europe, not to be confused with Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. For this review, I went and played the original version as I had only ever beaten the most recent remake, Adventures of Mana, on my PS TV. As I mentioned before, this game is a fairly one-to-one Zelda clone in terms of presentation and gameplay feel. However, the game has many RPG elements that help it stand apart from Zelda. For one, rather than dungeon items, you get these weapons that have practical use both in and out of combat, and are often used to progress. The game actually makes pretty good use of all of your weapons, which I find really cool. I think my biggest peeve with this game is the way that keys are handled. Similarly to Zelda 1, you will occasionally run across a locked door, and just like Zelda 1, you can purchase keys in shops. However, unlike Zelda, there aren't keys sprinkled around in the dungeon to make sure you can progress, so you want to make sure you are well stocked on keys before entering any dungeon. This can be especially punishing towards the end of the game when you have no shops to go to, but luckily some enemies can drop keys, so if you know what enemies to look for, you are probably going to be able to beat the game just fine. The game also gave you party members on occasion, but they never really take damage and are very selectively helpful. The frequency at which you swap party members seems to be handled similarly to Final Fantasy IV from what I've heard, where you're often given a new party member who is then kicked out of the game afterwards. The story was also a little better than how I remembered, but it also has all of the problems I mentioned before. However, I want to retract my comments about the music somewhat, as while I still hate the regular dungeon theme, there are several tracks from the game that I like quite a bit, with the later dungeons actually having a pretty sweet theme that reminds me of the Zelda Oracle games. Although there was a weird moment when I entered the town of Jad and noticed there was no music, at first I thought the game was bugged out or something, but once I rescued Lester, his song became the town theme, and I realized it was intentional. I guess it was just an artistic decision, I don't know. As far as Zelda clones go, this game is actually pretty darn solid, and if you wanted a more intense story-focused 2D Zelda game, you might like this game quite a bit. However, in my opinion, while this is a good start for this series, it doesn't feel like a Mana game to me. I bring all of this up because Sword of Mana is, with all intensive purposes, a brand new game. When you play these two games side by side, it becomes fundamentally clear the ways in which they are similar and different. Functionally, you do many of the same things, do the Colosseum, meet Fuji, go through the cave, go to the mansion, go to Wendell, etc., but the gameplay, world design, graphics, character writing, lore, and even cameos are completely different. The game also added an entirely new campaign for the female protagonist Fuji, who spent a majority of the original game kidnapped, and the game expands quite a bit on the story, with both routes having exclusive stretches of the game in the middle, which I find pretty cool. I won't go into too much detail right now about the specific differences, but rather I'm going to focus on what Sword of Mana brings to the table. As this game is so radically different, I could spend all day talking about how they change scenes here or there, or completely change the level design. If you are a fan of Secret of Mana and Trials, you will feel right at home playing this game. To begin with, the game plays most similar to Secret of Mana, however the stamina meter from that game is completely absent in this title, with the special meter from Trials and Legend of Mana making a return. Also returning from Secret of Mana and the original game is the ability to select and swap weapons at will on your main character, which are all used for combat and exploration on a regular basis, as well as the ring menu, which was mostly absent from Legend of Mana. So, control-wise it checks out for me and strikes a good balance between Secret of Mana and Trials' control feel. So far so good. Returning from Secret of Mana and Trials is the ability to freely switch between your main character and your party member. However, your party member will rotate around during your adventure, which I could see being disappointing for players of Secret of Mana, but for me, I found it kind of charming, since it gave you more characters to play as while giving the main character more people to bounce off narratively, which I really liked. Something missing entirely from this game, but I'm not too surprised considering this was on the Game Boy Advance, is co-op. Meaning that for this game you will have to rely on AI companions exclusively for this adventure, but odds are if you're playing Mana in this day and age, you would probably be used to this anyway. Magic is probably the most radically changed element of the gameplay. I suppose in an attempt to simplify magic from Legend of Mana to accommodate the Game Boy Advance's whopping 6 buttons, to begin, every magic type has a supportive spell and 8 offensive spells depending on the weapon you have equipped. To use the supportive spell, you press the R button once, and to use an offensive spell, you hold down the R button until you hear a sound, and then release the button to use it. The sword will do an up-close attack, the bow will fire a spell in an arc similar to an arrow, the staff will fire off a homing spell that attacks enemies hard and fast, the mace will fire off a big blast that splits off in multiple directions, and there are many other examples. Personally though, I found the most useful weapon for magic to be the Knuckles. At first I thought the Knuckles spell was worthless until I realized it actually fired off a spell you can guide around and hit enemies with like Yamcha in Dragon Ball Z. In fact, the Knuckles ended up being my go-to weapon for magic in my sumo route, since it allowed you to get multiple hits in on enemies if you used it correctly. Something that drove me crazy about this system the first time I played this game is it makes you switch weapons very frequently. When it isn't the environment wanting you to use certain weapons to regress, it's enemies that are completely resistant to certain weapon types of magic, meaning you have to open up a menu, open the weapon menu, select a weapon, and if you're using magic you have to open the menu, select the magic menu, select your magic type, open the menu again, open the weapon menu, and then select the weapon you want to use your magic with. Something that really baffles me is that many of the supportive spells are pretty much useless. Wisp heals you, Salamando buffs your attacks, Sylphid boosts your speed, Gnome boosts your defense, and Dryad boosts your magic defense. However, the rest essentially boil down to being a way to avoid enemies, which feels so moot when you have a run button that works just fine for doing this. The worst one though is Luna, which moogles you, and I find this baffling since this is a negative status effect in older games, and it pretty much still is in this game. I feel like this system might have been overstepping things given the GBA's limitations. In this sense, this is one area where I think the original game had it right. You select a spell and it gets mapped to the spell button. It is something you can get used to though, and after playing the original, I'd say you spend less time opening menus in Sword of Mana than in the original, which is a very big positive at the very least. Now, a very commonly criticized aspect of this game is your party member's AI, which has always been kind of dumb in the last 4 games, but feels even dumber than usual in this game. While the AI is stupid, I get the impression many people don't know you can customize the AI's behavior like in Secret of Mana and Trials. While it's not perfect, it saved Fuji and Lester, who can't reliably tank hits, from dying as often. I also found that your party members were also very useful for reducing the amount of weapon switching you have to do. As my typical strategy with enemies was to try my current weapon, and then my party member's weapon before resorting to switching. This is largely because most enemies have weaknesses to your party member's weapon. Because of this, I always made sure to have a different weapon equipped on my main character to keep the pace going. The risky part of this is that this game gives you an automatic game over whenever your main character dies, and so Angel Grails are used exclusively to revive your party members in this game. I'm not a fan of this, but perhaps it was done to increase the difficulty, since I probably wouldn't have gotten a game over once in my entire playthrough without this system. The game also brings in a couple new mechanics entirely, such as jumping and sitting. Jumping feels kinda awkward and is not really used for combat, but it does actually create some interesting level design. It reminds me quite a bit of the recent Trials of Mana remake, hiding treasure chests and loot all over the place. Sitting is an interesting mechanic. Since there are now enemies that are completely resistant to physical damage, this means you will have to use spells to damage them. But you might be in a situation where you'll run out of MP and be unable to kill the enemies, so the game added sitting as a mechanic. Essentially, as you sit, your MP will slowly restore, and while this is annoying at first, once I had the money for magic walnuts, I actually really like this mechanic. It gives you another option for handling your MP. Do you spend some time crouching down restoring your magic, or do you save time and use a walnut? While this is probably not the best solution to this, I do like this mechanic overall, and while I wish your MP restored faster, it would invalidate the fairy walnuts, so I'm okay with its inclusion.
Diabetes.
If you're a fan of Legend of Mana, this game added a nifty location called the Hot House, a place dedicated to mechanics from that game. While exploring, if you ever see a random pot on the ground, you can use it to plant a hothouse. Inside of it, you can do weapon and armor forging, as well as harvesting fruit from this tree, just like in Legend of Mana. The best thing to return, however, is my boy, Little Cactus. He serves pretty much the same function he had in Legend of Mana, only with some nice improvements. Unlike Legend, you don't have to remember to talk to him after every single quest, but instead you may find yourself walking in and out of the hothouse until he finishes logging the diary entries. It's not a perfect improvement, but I'll take it. The only thing I miss is that he will no longer give quips when you talk to him, which is pretty disappointing. I did find his diary entries pretty humorous though, as I guess he's been taking poetry classes, as all of his diary entries have rhymes in them, which I found pretty cute.
Though from a regime most tyrannical, new friend Marcy is so puritanical. He squeaks when he walks, and is loud when he talks. Such fun is an ally mechanical.
One aspect of the game that I don't think is best communicated, which is fitting for mechanics from Legend of Mana, is how forging and your equipment work. In Secret of Mana and Trials, and even the original game, you could purchase armor at shops or find them in dungeons. However, in this game you can only purchase accessories. I thought maybe this meant I didn't have any armor, but after investigating my stats, I realized that I actually did. From the very start, you have specific pieces of armor that you have to upgrade in the same way you upgrade your weapons, using materials you collect throughout your adventure. Now we're going to talk about Trials of Mana mechanics because there are actually quite a lot of them in this game. To start with, the day and night cycles from Trials as well as the day of the week system make a return. Just like in Trials, the individual days of the week affect the power of your spells, which isn't a huge deal and is something I just find fun to play around with. I also did not realize this during my first playthrough, but Sword of Mana actually brings back the class system of Trials of Mana, however it is executed in kind of a weird way this time. As you level up, you are given several level up types to choose from, and once you have 5 levels of any stat selected, you will be set onto that class line. From there you have light and dark classes that are dictated by the level up decisions you make. While I am very happy that the class system makes a return in this game, I feel like this is not the best way to execute it. I think having a system where maybe save points give you a class change option, where you can look at what classes you want to go for and what requirements and wants would be a much better system. As is, you kind of have to refer to a guide the entire time for this, which really is not the way to go in my opinion. But this is also not really new to Mana, as the original Trials didn't really even tell you what sort of skills or spells the classes gave you. Much of it was experimentation. One area where I find these classes disappointing is that unlike Trials, you only really get extra stats and bonuses with specific weapons. In Trials, there are several spells a character can never get unless they go down that specific pathway, and it's meant to interplay with your overall team composition. In this game, there are no unique spells unless you're a mage, but I'll get into that can of worms later. Even though I think it's a step down from Trials' class system, it still adds some replayability to the game, which is always appreciated. So all of this sounds pretty good so far, right? Well, it is. The gameplay honestly brings a vast amount of improvements while adding in several mechanics from the other games, and even some new mechanics as well, which is incredibly impressive on a Game Boy Advance. But we know that's not the end of this, so let's take some time to talk about the story. The story of Sword, when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, doesn't seem all that different from that of the original. However, the difference is in the tone. Where the original had its dark moments, it also was kind of quirky. I don't know if it's because of the retro feel, but very often the game just felt very silly with stuff like the Chocobo. Sword, on the other hand, looked at these darker elements and expanded the game around them, creating a very dramatic story. When you boot up the game, you'll see your typical prologue that briefly explains the game's backstory. That is, unless you're in Europe where they cut out the intro for seemingly no reason. I'm so sorry, you guys. As mentioned before, the story of this game is split into two routes for the main characters Sumo and Fuji. Sumo's story in particular is most similar to the original, as he was the main character of the original game. However, at the very beginning of the game, he and Fuji are given an introductory cutscene explaining how they got where they are at the beginning of the adventure. The main villains of this game are Prince Straw, now known as Dark Lord, yes, he really goes by that name, and Julius, an advisor who schemes from behind the scenes. In the original, there was also a character literally named Devious. I wish I was making this up, but here we are, and he is back in the game as well. This remake also introduces the character Grons, Dark Lord's father and former leader of the country. Now, a character who was drastically changed in this remake is Devious. In the original, he was just an evil general who manipulated Amanda into helping him. But in this remake, Devious is rewritten as a somewhat sympathetic character, and he's not the only one to get this treatment. Count Lee, who kidnapped Fuji early on in the original, is also given different motivations for his actions. In Fuji's story, a large amount of time is spent expanding on Dark Lord, Julius, Mavolia, the Mana Clan, and Bogard, while Sumo's focus more on setting up Dark Lord as the villain, and expanding on Kiba, the Gemma Knights, Amanda, and Devious. The argument I want to make here is while the story is the same when you look at the story beats in the many places you go to, they do not provide the same experience. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say it, this is the best story in the Mana series so far. It's very satisfying following Fuji's arc in particular, going from a woman haunted by her past and wanting to find out the truth, to being a hero who begins to see what lies ahead for her, but pushes forward regardless. In general, I just find this version of Fuji so much more compelling than the one in the original, who is a character I'd seen a million times and got kidnapped on a regular basis. I will say though that Sumo's story arc does feel less satisfying in this game. This is probably a side effect of Fuji gaining more agency, since in the original game, Fuji being kidnapped was a key motivation for the player, and since Fuji is more independent, some of this is lost in translation. Instead, both Sumo and Fuji are given an arc where they struggle with the fact that they have to kill people to solve their problems, making them just as bad as the antagonists in their eyes. It's an interesting take on their characters, but it often comes off as melodramatic. A major theme of the original was the theme of love. In the original, Sumo and Fuji very clearly cared about each other in a romantic way, and this theme is kept and expanded on in Sword of Mana. In fact, it's integrated into several other characters' backstories, such as Grons, Dark Lord, Devious, Count Lee, and Bogard. I just find this so darn cool, and I'm really amazed at what they did with this old story. I think my only criticism of the Sumo and Fuji plotline is that they never outright say they love each other, even in this one scene where it probably should have happened. Still, you can tell there is a connection there, and it's a very sweet scene regardless. Mavolia, a recurring place mentioned throughout the Mana series, ended up being a very important part of this game's world building, which I found really awesome. Many small characters and NPCs recognize and know Mavels, and several characters are revealed to be straight up from there, including major characters such as Medusa and Count Lee, which I really like a lot. In relation to that though, if there's one area of this remake that I found questionable, it would be the inclusion of Isabella and Gorman from Trials of Mana. Yes, I do mean from Trials of Mana, as it seems implied that these are in fact the same characters, which brings up a whole bunch of questions about how this game connects timeline-wise with Trials. So I haven't really addressed this before, but the Mana series is kind of like Zelda, where the games are usually designed first and foremost, and the story tends to develop out of the game itself. Because of this, trying to connect these games is near impossible to do. Stuff like the mana tree, the layout of the world, and the lore constantly change title to title, so it's near impossible to crack the code. Or is it?
Rowling's a girls. That might work too, so it might be possible that then... Oh my gosh, it's so obvious! Why didn't I figure this out before? Ah, jeez. This changes everything! The Mana game's all connected! I figured out the key!
Genma, I found the stuff that you wanted. Genma, what are you doing?
Don't you see? I've cracked the code!
Oh, I understand. Actually, no, I don't.
Look, see over here? There are multiple connections you can make about the Mana Tree. They have different rules in every single game, but the one singularity is that they are all women. So, this means the women can
Alright then,
become
have
trees.
fun with that,
Just
Genma. I'm
need
just gonna
Mana
go.
power. You'll all see once I post this to the internet. You guys will all see that I was right.
Putting continuity aside, another issue I have with the Trials characters is I don't think they are as well integrated into the plot as they should have been. Isabella has definitely handled the best out of the two characters, as she is given the most screen time and is used to help develop the bad guys. On the flip side though, Gorman kind of baffles me, and I'm not really sure why they put him into the game aside from fan service. He pretty much appears just to steal kills, and then shows up for one scene very late in the game only to disappear entirely from the story. There's even a removed scene I discovered while researching where Gorman essentially spoiled the ending of the game for the two main characters, and I definitely see why they cut it. To be honest, in every single scene he appears in, aside from the last scene, you could replace him with Julius and it would actually improve the story in my opinion. Now in regards to pacing, this is another area where Sword diverges a bit from the original game. In the original it was mostly gameplay driven, as you spent a majority of your time exploring the overworld, navigating dungeons, fighting bosses, and getting small bits of story in between. Sword of Mana feels very story-driven instead, with several scenes going on for a very long time due to how dialogue-heavy this game is compared to the original. So in general, the original moves at a fairly quick pace and there isn't that much story. However, in Sword you'll be in cutscenes for a while, with the introductory cutscenes taking around 10 minutes, while the original just kind of throws you in. In regards to the individual characters though, Sumo's roots seem to have more gameplay towards the middle and beginning, while Fuji's had more story during that section. While I enjoy the original's pacing, I actually like this structure quite a bit too. In RPG, having a lot of dialogue honestly doesn't bother me, since some of my favorite RPGs are games like Golden Sun and Trails in the Sky, which are notorious for having an absurd amount of talking in them, with this game actually sharing a localizer with Golden Sun, which I found kind of cool. In many ways, Sword reminds me of the interview I read about the original game, where the developers said they aimed to create an action RPG with a good story, so I think it's a very fitting direction. In many ways, I'd even say story-wise, this game mostly succeeds for me where the original failed narratively. So overall, I think they did a really good job with the story, expanding all of these original plot elements and making it into a much more cohesive narrative. The music, as mentioned before, was composed by Kenji Ito, who is not the most well-known composer out there, with the most relevant credit I can find being his contributions to the Saga franchise. During my first playthrough of Sword, I think there were many things working against me appreciating the soundtrack. To begin, I had played Adventures of Mana before this, so many of the tracks this had in common with that game had a fully orchestrated equivalent to compete with. Not to mention I had also been spoiled by games such as Golden Sun, which used the GBA sound chip incredibly well, where this game does not in my opinion. However, during my second playthrough, and after playing the original, I actually gained an appreciation for the soundtrack. Kenji Ito actually approached these songs with the new tone of the game in mind, taking songs like the cave theme and making it even more impressive than the original. There's also this remade version of the boss theme that I swear is trying to call back to Danger from Secret of Mana, although my friend told me that the beginning of the track reminded him of a deformed cat, and no, I will not elaborate on that. Go ask my friend Stupid Studios N. The game also features a large amount of new tracks to accompany the revamped cutscenes in new areas, but I think another nitpick I have about the execution of the music is that the song In Search of the Holy Sword is played much earlier in this game than in the original. In Final Fantasy Adventure, the song originally kicked in at the halfway point of the game, but now kicks in at the first third's completion, giving a new theme for the game's last third. In many ways though, this is another piece of evidence that the game is going for a very different tone from the original. I think this theme definitely fits the tone of the last third where hope is at its lowest, and the heroes need to find the Sword of Mana. And of course there is the most famous track from both the original and this remake, Touched by Courage and Pride, the theme of the confrontation with Dark Lord, with a really cool intro that was added to this remake and kept in Adventures of Mana. As a whole though, while this music grew on me and I've showcased way more here than in the last few reviews, I still find the score of this game to not be as impressive as Secret of Mana, Trials of Mana, or Legend of Mana. The main reason is I think most of this soundtrack is just too melancholy for my own liking. Call it personal taste, but it's how I feel. However, when the soundtrack wants to pump you up, it does so really well. I know this won't be my last time hearing Kenji Ito in this retrospective, as he is the original composer for the series and he's actually composing for the next two games I'm going to be looking at, so here's hoping he can impress me more the next time around. If there was one area of the game that I think was straight up handled badly, it would be the side content. Alright, let's go ahead and get the worst thing out of the way. In this game, you are able to collect 8 elementals just like previous games. However, unlike previous games, you can collect up to 7 additional spirits of each type that power up your attacks. It sounds really cool, right? Well, you haven't had to collect them yet! These things are so darn cryptic, I never even knew these extra spirits were a thing when I first played the game. For some of them, you have to use a specific save statue during the morning, some of which are located deep in dungeons, by the way. Another requires you to go to a specific screen on that spirit's day of the week, but only when you have 3 spirits of that type already, while also holding 10 trait coins of the same type. Trait coins that you have to farm from enemies, by the way, so I'm sure you can tell what a time sink this is. There's also a few really weird spirits you have to collect, such as the Dark Dud Bears. Alright, so this is off script, but I want to talk about the Dud Bears for a moment, because they ruined them in this game. I'm kidding, but, see, in Legend of Mana, they have a very specific dialect. You know, they have their dubs, they have their duds, they have their gaks, they have their dada-dadas. In Sword of Mana, they just go garumph. Isn't that funny? Garumph! Once you get an elemental up to level 30, you have to go to an old dungeon and kill the Dark Dud Bear to claim the spirit. The worst of these was located all the way back in Gron's castle, meaning I had to go out of my way and backtrack through 3 entire mini-dungeons to kill it, and there were a few others that were almost as bad, such as one in the subsea volcano. So what was the ultimate culmination of my efforts? Well, once you have collected 7 spirits of a certain type, you can go to the monastery in Wendell, where you'll get the last spirit of that type, and along with it you are rewarded with a super spell of that element that only a specific class can use. So I did all of that work, only to find out that me, as a ninja, am unable to use the super spells, even though I put in all of that effort collecting this stuff. Are you kidding me? The game evidently only wants you to collect these if you're in one of the mage class lines, and even then you probably want to know ahead of time which spell you want to go for. This is just... ugh. Thing is, I see what they were going for, attempting to add unique perks to certain class lines, but really it just makes it so you have very conditional rewards for a lot of work. If they were going to make them such a hassle to get, they really should have just given you the super spell regardless of your class. As is, it is so incredibly deflating, and I sincerely hope Gerard does not go anywhere near this game, because holy crap, this is awful. Another part of the game that baffled me was this quest where I had to gather these summon cards to show this old man. Upon looking it up, I found out the game has these 7 summon cards that basically allow you to summon one of the 7 wonders from Legend of Mana. Well, that's awesome! How do you get them though? Well, as an attempt to make up for the lack of co-op, the game has what is known as the Amigo system. Using a link cable, you are able to link up with a friend who has the game and trade items. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's the big downside. In order to get all 7 cards, you need to have 100 friends added to your Amigo page.
I love locking features behind social elements.
So how did I manage that in 2020 with a game that pretty much no one bought? I had to basically take 2 copies of the game, and on 1 copy, Pokemon style, essentially play up to the first save point, save my game, link it up, and then register that friend in my actual save file. I had to repeat this 100 times. Do I look like I'm having fun? Many games on the Game Boy Advance did stuff like this, and honestly it has made every one of those games age very badly. Locking entire features around these social elements is so absurd, and even more absurd is, did they really think people would have 100 friends who all have a copy of this game? But here's the kicker. The summons are pretty darn awesome, and I had a lot of fun using them on all of the enemies and seeing what they looked like, but it definitely wasn't worth the hours of pushing through the intro just to add myself. I just want friends. Now, in regards to side quests, they actually added a lot to this game. However, they're a far cry from Legend of Mana, as a large chunk of them are your standard RPG stuff. Run around, kill things, collect materials, etc. I did notice a really weird recurring theme of these side quests though, where you end up doing questionable things. Firstly, there was this really weird quest with this old man. See, he was frozen for around 20 years and so his plant died. Since he's really torn up over losing his plant, he asked if he could have Little Cactus to replace it. Later in the game, when you talk to him, you find out Little Cactus was so heartbroken at you giving him up that he began to wilt, so the old man returned him to you, leading Little Cactus to write this in his journal. I'm so sorry. There was also a quest with this one guy who pretty much gets all philosophical on you about whether there's a mana goddess or not, and eventually lets himself be taken away by Inquisitors so he can talk to the Dark Lord about these philosophical concepts, and we just kind of let it happen.
Do you believe in God? That's a complicated question. It depends on what you mean by God. You see, yes or no. It helps no one to be reductive. I believe that we are here implies to some degree that there are forces larger than us. Now we can get into the semanticality. Yes or no. I need to talk to you a lot more about this. Would you be interested in reading some of my literature? No!
There's also this really shady guy that sells dud bears you can keep inside of your hothouse, but since I was trying to complete my little cactus log, I had to do the quest, so I bought a dud bear. And, yeah, that's a dud bear in my hothouse, not really doing anything. Why did I do this again? So after completing every quest, finding every spirit, and getting all the summon cards, was it worth it? Nope! But here's the thing, at least all of this is optional, and playing through the game as a minimalist and only caring about the story is actually a really fun time. As I mentioned before, I didn't even realize the extra spirits were a thing until after my Fuji playthrough, and speaking honestly, the game was balanced fine without them. If you did want to go for them, I suggest only really going for one single ultimate spell, since you can only really get one anyway, and I think that should be the limit at which you should go for them. If you want to do the side content, take it from me, just play the game normally. At this point, I think I made it clear how different this game is than the original game. Many fans look at these changes as padding, unnecessary, and damaging to the pace of the original. And many of these fans would even go so far as to talk about this game as if they changed it maliciously. As if they were embarrassed by the original, wanting to purge every single element of the game that made it great. But I don't think this remake was done maliciously at all. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done stuff like slip in this scene that I noticed while hanging on the title screen. If they hated the original, why keep the overall structure of the story? Why remake the game at all? I think this game was made on some level for fans of the original too, to show them a new look at their favorite game and provide those fans with a new experience. If you don't like this version, that is perfectly fine, but I don't think that invalidates the quality of this game, and if anything, I think this game and the original complement each other. It was actually kind of fun playing them side by side and comparing them. While I prefer Sword of Mana, I think Final Fantasy Adventure and Adventures of Mana scratch a very different itch. In complete honesty, this is one of the better Mana games I've had to play in this marathon so far, but I do think it oversteps a bit in certain areas, especially in the endgame. The game uses Secret of Mana as a basis, integrating elements of the original, Trials of Mana, and Legend of Mana to create a very interesting reimagining of the original game. Legitimately, if you're someone who cannot get into Legend of Mana because of how much it changed from the formula, I think you should give this game a chance, as you might find this game to provide more of what you're looking for. The unfortunate thing about this game is that it has not been re-released at all, and given how well received Adventures of Mana is by old fans, the future of this game is uncertain. I'd love to see this game and Legend of Mana featured on maybe another Mana collection, and if we want Square to do so, I think we need to get their attention. As such, for once, if you watch this review and want this game to be re-released, possibly with new features such as co-op, I want all of you guys to tweet at Square Enix with the hashtag FreeTheSword, and let them know you want the game ported, and also express interest in those added features to the game. It can be as simple as one tweet. At the end of the day, I think Sword of Mana is a fantastic game, and if you are someone who has never played this before but are a fan of Secret of Mana and Trials, I hope you'll give this game a shot. If you're a fan of the original game, I hope I offered a new perspective, and even if we don't agree, I hope we can have a civil conversation about it. Alright, I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in this review. This one was a whole lot of work to get done in particular compared to the last review. Some of it had to do with the fact that this one was kind of a lot easier to talk about exactly what I liked and disliked, and it also had not as much going on as Legend of Mana, but enough going on that there was just that much to talk about. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video despite its length. The next review is going to be Dawn of Mana for the PlayStation 2, and hoo boy, this one has quite the reputation, so we'll see how that one turns out. But it's going to be a bit before you guys get that video, probably about as long as it took for this one, even though it has been a couple months. The main reason is I'm going to be taking some time to myself for self-improvement stuff. I'll talk about that in a later update video. And in general, man, I don't know what I'm going to think of this one, but you guys will see eventually when that happens. So feel free to hit the subscribe button down below so you can stay updated for when that review does eventually come out. And also feel free to share the last few videos in particular. I put a lot of work into these, way more than really any other video in this channel in particular. So this whole series has been kind of experimental for me, and I've had a lot of fun making these reviews, and I think they've turned out really well. And if you guys like this review and like this game, Sword of Mana, again, I hope I brought a new perspective to all of you guys, and I think it's a really solid game. But regardless, again, thank you guys so much for tuning into this review. I'll see you guys later with Dawn of Mana, and have a nice day. Bye. Well, at least I can say I finished every single version of Seiken Densetsu 1. What's this? Look at it. Ah!